The world is composed of many countries or states, all of them having different forms of government. Some scholars of politics are interested in individual states and examine the internal politics of these countries. For example, a scholar studying the politics of Japan may write about the history of its bureaucracy. Other scholars are more interested in the interactions between states rather than their internal politics. In this particular lesson, you should be able to identify key events in the development of international relations, differentiate the internationalization from globalization, define the state and the nation, distinguish between the competing conceptions of internationalism, and discuss the historical evolution of international politics. These scholars look at trade deals between states. They also study political, military, and other diplomatic engagements between two or more countries. These scholars are studying international relations. Moreover, when they explore the deepening of interactions between states, they refer the phenomenon of internationalization. Internationalization does not equal globalization, although it is a major part of globalization. As we explained in our first lesson, globalization encompasses a multitude of connection and interaction that cannot be reduced to the ties between governments. Nevertheless, it is important to study international relations as a facet of globalization because states, governments, are key drivers of global processes. In this lesson, we will examine internationalization as one window to view the globalization of politics. Although this subject is about contemporary world, we cannot avoid history. What international relations are today is largely defined by events that occurred as far back as 400 years ago. But don't worry, we will eventually discuss contemporary world politics. But to do that, we need to first work backward. So this lesson will begin with identifying the major attributes of contemporary global politics and then proceed to ask, how did this system emerge? In doing so, we will have a solid foundation to understand the major issues of global governance on the next lesson. World politics today has 4 key attributes. First, there are countries or states that are independent and govern themselves. Second, these countries interact with each other through diplomacy. Third, there are international organizations like the United Nations that facilitate these interactions. Fourth, beyond simply facilitating meetings between states, international organizations also take on lives of their own. The UN, for example, apart from being a meeting ground for presidents and other heads of states, also has task-specific agencies like World Health Organization and the International Labor Organization. What are the origins of this system? A good start is by unpacking what one means when he or she says a country, or what academics also call the nation-state. This concept is not as simple as it seems. The nation-state is a relatively modern phenomenon in human history, and people did not always organize themselves as countries. At different parts in the history of humanity, people in various regions of the world have identified exclusively with units as small as their village or their tribe, and at other times, they see themselves as a member of a larger political categories like Christendom or the entire Christian world. The nation-state is composed of 2 non-interchangeable terms. Not all states are nations, and not all nations are states. The nation of Scotland, for example, has its own flag and national culture, but still belongs to a state called United Kingdom. Closer to home, many commentators believe that the Bangsamoro is a separate nation existing within the Philippines, but through their elites, recognizes the authority of the Philippine state. Meanwhile, if there are states with multiple nations, there are also single nations with multiple states. The nation of Korea is divided into North and South Korea, whereas the Chinese nation may refer to both the People's Republic of China, the mainland, and Taiwan. So what then is the difference between nation and state? In layman's terms, state refers to a country and its government. For example, the government of the Philippines. A state has four attributes. First, it exercises authority over a specific population, called its citizens. Second, it governs a specific territory. Third, a state has a structure of government that crafts various rules that people or the society follow. Fourth, and the most crucial, the state has sovereignty over its territory. Sovereignty here refers to internal and external authority. Internally, no individuals or groups can operate in a given national territory by ignoring the state. This means that the groups like church, civil society organization, corporations, and other entities have to follow the laws of the state where they establish their parishes, offices, or headquarters. Externally, sovereignty means that a state's policies and procedures are independent of the interventions of other states. Russia or China, for example, cannot pass laws for the Philippines and vice versa. On the other hand, the nation, according to Benedict Anderson, is an imagined community. It is limited because it does not go beyond a given official boundary, and because rights and responsibilities are mainly the privilege and concern of the citizens of that nation. Being limited means that the nation has its boundaries. This characteristic is in stark contrast to many religious imagined communities. Anyone, for example, can become a Catholic if one chooses to. In fact, Catholics want more people to join their community. But not everyone can simply become a Filipino. An American cannot simply go to the Philippine Embassy and convert into a Philippine citizen. Nations often limit themselves to people who have imbibed a particular culture, speak a common language, and live in a specific territory. Calling it imagined does not mean that the nation is made up. Rather, the nation allows one to feel a connection with a community of people, even if he or she will never meet all of them in his or her lifetime. When you cheer for a Filipino athlete in the Olympics, for example, it is not because you personally know that athlete. Rather, you imagine your connection as both members of the same Filipino community. In a given national territory, like the Philippine archipelago, you rest in the comfort that the majority of people living in it are all Filipinos. Finally, most nations strive to become states. Nation builders can only feel a sense of fulfillment when that national ideal assumes an organizational form whose authority and power are recognized and accepted by the people. Moreover, if there are communities that are not states, they often seek some form of autonomy within their mother states. This is why, for example, the nation of Quebec, though belonging to the state of Canada, has different laws about language. They are French-speaking and require French language competencies for their citizens. It is also for this reason that Scotland, though part of the United Kingdom, has a strong independence movement led by the Scottish Nationalist Party. Nation and state are closely related because it is nationalism that facilitates state formation. In the modern and contemporary era, it has been the nationalist movement that have allowed for the creation of nation-states. States become independent and sovereign because of the nationalist sentiment that clamors for this independence. Sovereignty is thus one of the fundamental principles of modern state politics. Understanding how this became the case entails going back as far as 400 years ago. The origins of the present-day concept of sovereignty can be traced back to the Treaty of Westphalia, which was a set of agreements signed in 1648 to end the 30 Years' War between the major continental powers of Europe. After a brutal religious war between Catholics and Protestants, the Holy Roman Empire, Spain, France, Sweden, and the Dutch Republic designed a system that would avert wars in the future by recognizing that the treaty signers exercise complete control over their domestic affairs and swear not to meddle in each other's affairs. The Westphalian system provided stability for the nations of Europe until it faced its first major challenge by Napoleon Bonaparte. Bonaparte believed in spreading the principles of the French Revolution: liberty, equality, and fraternity to the rest of Europe, and thus challenged the power of kings, nobility, and religion in Europe. The Napoleonic Wars lasted from 1803 to 1815, when Napoleon and his armies marching all over much of Europe. In every country they conquered, the French implemented the Napoleonic Code that forbade birth privileges, encouraged freedom of religion, and promoted meritocracy in government service. This system shocked the monarchies and the hereditary elites, dukes and duchesses of Europe, and they mustered their armies to push back against the French emperor. Anglo and Prussian armies finally defeated Napoleon in the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, ending the latter mission to spread this liberal code across Europe. To prevent another war and to keep their systems of privilege, the royal powers created a new system that in effect restored the Westphalian system. The Concert of Europe was an alliance of great powers, the United Kingdom, Austria, Russia, and Prussia, that sought to restore the world of monarchical, hereditary, and religious privileges of the time before the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. More importantly, it was an alliance that sought to restore the sovereignty of states. Under this Metternich system, named after the Australian diplomat Clemens von Metternich, who was the system's main architect, the concert's power and authority lasted from 1815 to 1914, at the dawn of World War I. Despite the challenge of Napoleon to the Westphalian system and the eventual collapse of the Concert of Europe after World War I, present-day international system has traces of this history. Until now, states are considered sovereign, and Napoleonic attempts to violently impose systems of government in other countries are frowned upon. Moreover, like the concert system, great powers still hold significant influence over world politics. For example, the most powerful grouping in the UN, The Security Council has a core of 5 permanent members, all having veto powers over the Council's decision-making process. The Westphalian and consort systems divided the world into separate sovereign entities. Since the existence of this interstate system, there have been attempts to transcend it. Some, like Bonaparte, directly challenged the system by infringing on other states' sovereignty, while others sought to imagine other systems of governance that go beyond, but do not necessarily challenge sovereignty. Still, others imagine a system of heightened interaction between various sovereign states, particularly the desire for greater cooperation and unity among states and peoples. This desire is called internationalism. Internationalism comes in different forms, but the principle may be divided into 2 broad categories like liberal internationalism and socialist internationalism. The first major thinker of liberal internationalism was the late 18th century German philosopher Immanuel Kant. Kant liked state in a global system to people living in a given territory. If people living together require a government to prevent lawlessness, shouldn't the same principle be applied to states? Without a form of world government, he argued, the international system would be chaotic. Therefore, states, like citizens of countries, must give up some freedoms and establish a continuously growing state consisting of various nations, which will ultimately include the nations of the world. In short, Kant imagined a form of global government. The Socialist International was a union of European socialists and labor parties established in Paris in 1889. Although short-lived, the SI achievements included the declaration of May 1 as Labor Day and the creation of the International Women's Day. Most importantly, it initiated the successful campaign for an 8-hour workday. Internationalism is one window into the broader phenomenon of globalization. Nevertheless, it is a very crucial aspect of globalization, since global interactions are heightened by the increased interdependence of states. This increased interdependence manifests itself not just through state-to-state relations. Increasingly, international relations are also facilitated by international organizations that promote global norms and policies. The most prominent example of this organization, of course, is the United Nations.